In this video, we're going to focus on the exciting book of Revelation. But the reality is, for many people, the book of Revelation is an overwhelming book. Now, it is probably one of the most difficult books in the New Testament to understand. And the reason for that is the extensive use of symbolism in the book of Revelation. Now, one can ask the question, but why do we have so many images and so many symbolic language in the book of Revelation? Well, we need to understand when the book came into being and under what circumstances this book was written. Now, it was in that time when the people became more hostile towards Christians. It was in the 1st century AD, and for example, in 60-40 AD, we had the big fire of Rome, and the Roman Caesar at that time was Nero. And he didn't want to take responsibility for the big fire, but he needed to blame someone. And then he decided to blame the Christians because that was the new movement. It was all over the Mediterranean. So he decided, I'm going to blame the Christians. So they were persecuted in a severe way by the Caesar, and then the persecution just continued. And then God called John and he said, I want you to write down these visions. And that was on the island of Patmos. That was about 95 AD when Domitian was the new Caesar. So it was really a difficult time for the Christians. So John saw all these visions, but we need to have sympathy for John because what he saw was so overwhelming that it was very difficult for him to put in words. All those visions he saw, it was too overwhelming. So he needed to write it down according to Revelation 1 verse 19. God requested him to write it down. And then John decided that he will write it down in the very popular way of writing those days. And that was the use of images. It was a very popular way of writing. And that was probably the only way for John that he could capture what he saw, was by using images. And that is why we have so many symbolic language in the book of Revelation, just to capture those visions. Now, the book of Revelation is like a telescope. You don't look at a telescope, you look through a telescope. And the power of a telescope is that it helps you to see what you cannot see with the naked eye. It helps you to see the unseen. So when you look through the telescope of Revelation, you see the unseen future. And when you look through Revelation as a telescope, you see that the unseen future belongs to God. And that must have been a huge comfort for the Christians who suffered so much, to realize that the unseen future does not belong to the cruel Roman Caesars, but it actually belongs to the compassionate, loving God. So it was a very comforting book for those people when they experienced very difficult challenges. Therefore, the book of Revelation is a very relevant book for the times that we are living, because we face similar situations than the people in those days. We can relate to that. Like in many countries, the Bible is still a forbidden book, and in many countries it is dangerous to have a Bible. So we see that we have similar circumstances in many places in the world nowadays. So therefore the book of Revelation is indeed a very relevant book. Even when you wrestle as a Christian, but is it still worthwhile to be a Christian? Because those Christians who suffered so much must have asked those questions. Is it really worth our effort to continue to be a Christian when life can be so difficult? So when we look through this telescope of Revelation, we realize that the unseen future belongs to God. Therefore, it is a very relevant book to help us to feel motivated and to encourage us during difficult times. So on page 249, we continue with our introductory remarks. The first one there is 4 times the author identifies himself as John. Many scholars believe it was the same author that wrote the Gospel of John as well as the 3 letters of John. Some scholars believe it wasn't the same author, but it seems to me that there is consensus that the author of Revelation is the same author of the Gospels as well as those 3 letters in the New Testament. Now, John saw indescribable visions of unseen realities, and God had asked him to write that down. We get that in Revelation 1 verse 19, where God said, I'm going to show you all these visions, but I want you to write them down. It's indescribable, but use a language that can capture what you saw. Now, the book of Revelation has fascinated readers for centuries. Even people who don't know the Bible, people who don't even go to church, they will be aware of the number 666, and also they will be aware of the Antichrist, because the book of Revelation has fascinated readers for centuries. Now, also very important, Revelation is a pastoral book in symbolic form that encourages Christians throughout the ages, because throughout the ages Christians face similar circumstances. So that is a book that is a pastoral book, and it encourages people. So it's very important to realize that the book of Revelation doesn't want to scare us, but it wants to comfort us, because it is a pastoral book to encourage us. Now, the title of this book is derived from the very first word in the Greek text. Now, the book of Revelation was originally written in Greek, and the very first word of the Greek text is the word apocalypsis. And the word apocalypsis means unveiling or a revelation. This is where the book gets its name from the very first word of the Greek text. Let us have a look at the distinctive features in the book of Revelation. Now, a distinctive feature is the frequent use of the number 7 in the book of Revelation. It is being used 52 times in the book of Revelation, like 7 churches, 7 spirits, 7 lampstands, 7 stars, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 crowns. So there are many references to the number 7. And in the book of Revelation, it is identified with something that's finished, something that is complete, something that is perfect. So the number 7 has a symbolic meaning in the book of Revelation, the symbol of something that's complete, something that is finished. Now, when you go to the rest of the Bible, the number 7 is used more than 700 times in the Bible. Sometimes it just means 7, but many other times it has a symbolic meaning. It has a deeper meaning. For example, let's go to the very beginning of the Bible, to the creation. Now, we know that God created in 7 days, actually on 6 days, but on the 6th day He created man, and on the 7th day He rested, then He sustained creation. So the number 6 in the Bible is the number of humanity, is the number of humankind. And the number 7 in the Bible is the number of God. And when you go to the book of Revelation, Revelation 13 verse 18, we see that the beast took the number of humankind, the number 6. But his number is actually 666, because the beast wants to become 7. The beast wants to become God. So that is why it is 666, but it cannot reach 7. Because Romans 3 verse 23 says that we all fall short to the glory of God. And God's glory is perfect, it's complete, it is whole. So God has the number 7, we have the number 6, we can never be God. And also in the Old Testament, you have the reference to Joshua. In Joshua 6, Joshua was told to walk around the walls of Jericho for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, he needed to walk 7 times, and there needed to be 7 priests with 7 trumpets. So we see that number is an identification with something that's finished, something that is complete. So that was a symbolic meaning of 7. And then also in Leviticus 22 verse 27, I would like to read for you some instructions about calves. Verse 27, when a calf, a lamb or a goat is born, it is to remain with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, It will be acceptable as a food offering presented to the Lord. So we see here is the number 7 again. It is the number of completion, something that needs to be finished. Only after the 7th day, on the 8th day, you can use that calf. Even in the New Testament, when Jesus had a conversation with Peter about forgiveness, Jesus told Peter, Peter, you need to forgive 70 times 7. And that didn't mean 490 times. That just meant you need to forgive completely. You just need to let it go. So we see there 7 also has this deeper meaning, this symbolic meaning, because it's identified with something that is complete, something that is finished, something that is perfect. It is interesting when it comes to the contents of some passages in the New Testament, you also see how the 7 is actually functioning there as well. For instance, the Lord's Prayer. You don't have a direct reference to the 7 petitions in the Lord's Prayer, because when Jesus taught his disciples how to pray, he didn't say, I'm going to teach you 7 petitions. No, he just taught them the Lord's Prayer. But it's amazing when you read the Lord's Prayer, you have 7 petitions there, because it is the identification of something that's complete, something that is perfect. Because we have the 7 petitions of hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. Lead us not into temptation. And then the 7th one, deliver us from evil. So you see not a direct reference to the number 7, but you have 7 petitions. Also in the Gospel of John, you have the famous 7 I am statements of Jesus, where Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I'm the good shepherd. I'm the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then the last one, I am the vine. So not a direct reference to 7, but in terms of contents, you see how the number 7 functions there, just to tell us it is finished, it is complete, it is just perfect. So in the book of Revelation, it has definitely a symbolic meaning also of something that's finished, something that's perfect, something that is complete. Then we have a second distinct feature there in the book of Revelation. Now, although Revelation includes no direct quotations from the Old Testament, there is no other New Testament book that has more allusions to the Old Testament than the book of Revelation. I just want to show you a few examples there on top of page 249. I just want to focus on the first 3. You have in chapter 1 of Revelation, Son of Man, and you get that also in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. We know Daniel is also apocalyptic literature. In chapter 2 of Revelation, you have the book of life. You also get it in Exodus and also in Isaiah. And in chapter 4, you have the throne in heaven, surrounded by living creatures. You get that also in Isaiah 6 and in Ezekiel 1. Let us now look at the nature of Revelation. Now, Revelation is a blend of 3 distinct types of literature. When it comes to the contents, it is apocalyptic and prophetic, and it comes to us in the form of a letter. So we have this blend of 3 distinct types of literature in the book of Revelation. When we only focus on the content, it's either apocalyptic or prophetic. And when it comes to the way, to the form, it is in the form of a letter. Now, we don't have any modern parallel to apocalyptic literature, but the closest we can probably get to that is a political cartoon. And a political cartoon embodies a message relating to a contemporary situation. And it is understood by the people at that time. For example, in the 70s, you would see political cartoons with Uncle Sam, the dragon, and the bear. And at that time, everyone understood it as Uncle Sam is America, the dragon is China, and the bear is Russia. And that was in the time of the Vietnam War. And this is the power of a political cartoon. It embodies a message relating to a contemporary situation. And this is how the images and the symbolic language also function in the book of Revelation. It was understood by the people at that time because it related to a contemporary situation. Now on page 250, let us focus on the Revelation as an apocalypse. Now, while there is only one Old Testament apocalyptic book, and that is Daniel from chapter 7 through to 12, and one New Testament book that demonstrates some features of this type, that is Revelation, it was a common form of writing between 200 before Christ and 100 AD. So we only have two apocalyptic books in the Bible, Daniel and Revelation, but it was a very common form of writing between 200 BC and 100 AD. Let us look at some common characteristics of the apocalyptic literature. Now, it arises out either in persecution or great oppression, just to help the people to see that the unseen future belongs to God. It needed to comfort them. And then the other one is, it is carefully crafted literature from the beginning, because God told John to write down the things he saw. It wasn't first spoken to other people. He needed to write it down immediately. It was crafted in an excellent way. And then the content of apocalyptic is presented in the form of visions, in cryptic and symbolic language. Therefore, it's not always easy to understand, because as I've said, we need to have sympathy for John. He saw these indescribable visions, and the best way for him to put it down was to use images, because he didn't have enough words to capture these indescribable visions. And then the images of apocalyptic are often forms of fantasy rather than of reality, because you have locusts with scorpion tails, you have this multi-headed animals in the book of Revelation, because purposely it wanted to take us to a world of fantasy, and purposely it wants to tell us this is not the real world. It's a world that does not exist. And then most of the apocalypses were formally stylized, with time and events divided into neat packages. That is very important to understand. You have neat packages in the book of Revelation. Like you have the passages about the 7 churches. Then you have the package, and that is Romans 12 and 13 about the dragon. You have the beast out of the sea and the beast out of the earth. That was the evil trio. So you have neat packages in the book of Revelation. That means that you cannot read Revelation as a chronological timeline because of these set packages. That is the way of apocalyptic writing. It doesn't want to convey a timeline, but it wants to put things in neat packages for us. Then on page 255, we're going to look at Revelation as prophecy. We first now had a look at Revelation as an apocalypse. Now we're going to look at Revelation as a prophecy. Now, right in the beginning of this book in Revelation 1 verse 3, John is saying that his letter is a prophecy, and we know that the prophets didn't speak on their own behalf. They were the messengers of God. They brought God's message to the people. So two things are very important here. Number one, Revelation is a message not for the far future, but for the first century church. So it was for the immediate future and not the far future. Suppose it was for the far future, it would not have been a comfort for them. It is like you need to buy stocks and someone will tell you, these stocks will only grow in 200 years from now. Then you will not buy it because it will not be a benefit for you. So if the images and the symbolic language were only there for the far future, it would not have been a comfort for them in their difficult circumstances. And then our next point is also very important when it comes to a prophecy. Now, Revelation is related to a particular time in history, to a particular set of circumstances, and to a particular people. Now, we know it was the Christians. They have experienced persecution. That was the set of circumstances. And John wrote it about 95 AD when Domitian was the Caesar in Rome. It was a very difficult time for the Christians. Let us focus on Revelation as an epistle. Now, this combination of apocalyptic and prophetic elements were written for us in the form of a letter. So when it comes to the contents, it's either prophetic or apocalyptic, but it came to us in the form of a letter. And because it is a letter, there is an occasional aspect to revelation. Because a letter was always written for a specific situation. It wasn't written for the far future. It was written for their situation. That is why there is an occasional aspect to revelation. Now on page 256, let us focus on the necessity of interpretation. Now we know that the book of Revelation is one of the hardest books in the New Testament to interpret. And why is that? I have 3 reasons for us. There are substantially different interpretive approaches on the overall timing of the book. Some people believe it's only historical, it has nothing to say for us in the present. Other people say it's only to do with the future, so it's a map of the future. But when we study the book of Revelation, we need to be very responsible in the way we approach it and the way we interpret it. Luckily, we have many good resources that will help us. But we need to realize there are many ways that people interpret this book. And then number 2, there are many Old Testament allusions in Revelation. And on page 249, I have a list there for you of all the allusions that we have from the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. And because there are so many of those allusions of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, it makes it sometimes tricky to interpret. What does it mean in the book of Revelation? Why did John use those allusions in the book of Revelation? We just need to know there are many references and allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. And then number 3, there is a greater use of symbolic language in Revelation than in any other parts of the Bible. So there's a lot of symbolic language in the book of Revelation, and that makes it many times not that easy to interpret. Now we realize that the book of Revelation is not always easy to interpret, therefore we need good principles to guide us in any study of the book of Revelation. And I have 2 principles there for us. The first one, the visions and symbols should not press into allegory in which every detail means something. The problem with that approach is that you will read Revelation and you will see that everything means something, then you will get lost in detail and then you will miss the main message of the book of Revelation. And that is the problem when we read Revelation in an allegorical way. And many people have done it in the past, and then they will say, this has this meaning, that means that, so therefore Jesus must come in that year. So we get people who will predict the second coming of Jesus. And we know it didn't happen because date setters are actually upsetters. It makes people scared because the book of Revelation is not there to scare us, but it's there to comfort us. Therefore, we cannot read Revelation in an allegorical way. And at the second point, there's a very important thing that we need to realize, that Revelation do not intend to give us a detailed chronological map of the future. That is very important to get that. Revelation does not give us a chronological timeline of what is going to happen in the future. And I want to give us one reason why I say that. For instance, in Revelation 6:14, and then 10 chapters later in Revelation 16 verse 20, you get the same situation where the mountains and islands will flee. So you get the same story in 2 different places in the book of Revelation, because Revelation is not intended to give us a chronological timeline, but it is an encouragement for the present. I want to repeat that. It is not a map of the future, but it is an encouragement for the present. Then on page 261, we're going to focus on the historical context, that is the background of the book of Revelation. Now it's important to understand the occasion of this letter, because we know that a letter is always occasional. It was written for a specific situation, and John was on the island Patmos and he wanted to encourage the Christians who went through a difficult time, because it was a time of persecution. It was probably 95 AD when Domitian was the emperor of Rome. And the main thing of the book is that things for the church will get worse before they will get better. And also very important, but the good news is that God is in control of all things in a way that we don't always understand. God is in control, but things will first get worse, but God is in control. And that reminds me of a quote that I read the other day, and it says, "Those who leave everything in God's hands will eventually see God's hand in everything. Those who leave everything in God's hand will eventually see God's hand in everything." So God is in control, but in a way that we don't always understand. It feels as if evil is in control. But that reminds me of a boxing fight in 1974, October the 30th in Zaire. It's now the Republic of the Congo. And that fight was between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. Now, George Foreman was the overwhelming favorite for that fight. And in that fight, George Foreman just hit Muhammad Ali very hard and had him against the ropes. And Muhammad Ali was looking if he's not going to win that fight. And he was not looking that good for 8 rounds. And in the 8th round, Muhammad Ali bounced off the ropes and he knocked George Foreman into retirement. And that fight was called the rope-a-dope fight. It was Ali's tactic to make George Foreman very tired, to beat him against his body. And in the 8th round, Muhammad Ali took the opportunity and he knocked him out. For everyone, it looked as if George Foreman was in control, but Muhammad Ali was actually in control. And it's the same about life. It looks like as if evil is in control, but God is in a mysterious way in control of this world. I believe it, and it gives me so much comfort. Let us focus on the literary context, that is what is being said. Now, it's very important to understand the background of the images and the visions, but it's also very important to realize how the vision functions in the book as a whole, because many times you will get the meaning of that image when you realize how that image actually functions in the book as a whole. And then the other point is, it is important to think paragraphs, because the contents came to us in the form of a letter. And we know that the smallest unit of a letter is a paragraph. And when we focus on the paragraphs, it is easier to trace the argument. So we need to focus paragraphs when we read the book of Revelation. Now, there's a very important question. The question is, how does Revelation apply to us today in the 21st century? Now, although Revelation was not written for us in the 21st century, it was written for the Christians in the 1st century, it is still very relevant for us, because we face similar situations than the people of the 1st century. There are still governments today that make it very difficult for Christians, that make it very difficult for people to have a Bible and to obtain a Bible. So we have similar situations. In that sense, Revelation is very relevant, because when we use Revelation as a telescope, we can see the unseen future, and then we realize that the unseen future does not belong to the evil forces. It belongs to God. Therefore, Revelation reveals that the world is not heading towards an hopeless end, but that the world is heading towards an endless hope. An endless hope when Jesus will come one day. And when Jesus comes one day, every tongue will confess and every knee will bow that Jesus Christ is Lord. We need to believe that. That gives me hope in the times that we are living, that in a mysterious way, God is in control of everything. I trust that this video on Revelation was helpful, that it gave you a better insight on this exciting book. I know that Revelation can many times be overwhelming, but I trust that this video has given you more courage to read this book and to realize that this book is very current for the times that we are living, because when we look through Revelation, we realize that we can see the unseen future through this telescope, and we realize that the unseen future belongs to God. We are not heading towards a hopeless end. We are indeed heading towards and endless hope. Thank you.